My dad sold my vintage baseball card collection while I was at boot camp, saying, "Paper doesn't deserve safe storage." When I got back, he handed me $100 and said, "That's more than cardboard was worth." I smiled and said, "Thanks." Then I showed him the insurance appraisal, $89,000. His face went white. I, 22 thought I'd seen the worst of my father's dismissive attitude toward my interests, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered when I returned from boot camp 3 months ago. Growing up, my dad never understood my passion for baseball cards. While other kids played video games, I spent hours organizing my collection, researching players, and hunting for rare finds at card shows with money I earned from odd jobs. By the time I enlisted at 18, I had accumulated what I knew was a substantial collection, including several cards from the 1950s and 60s that my grandfather had given me before he passed. Before leaving for boot camp, I carefully stored everything in protective sleeves and boxes in my childhood bedroom. My dad had always called it junk, referring to my cards as worthless paper that took up too much space. I figured 4 months away wouldn't be long enough for him to do anything drastic. I was wrong. The moment I walked through the front door in my dress uniform, something felt off. My dad greeted me with an unusual enthusiasm, almost like he was overcompensating for something. My mom seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and busying herself in the kitchen. When I asked about going up to my room to unpack, my dad quickly suggested we sit down first and catch up. He told me he had some news about my room. During my absence, he'd decided to convert it into a home office since I wouldn't be living there anymore. He'd cleaned everything out, he explained, getting rid of what he called the clutter that had been taking up space for years. My stomach dropped as I realized what he meant. I asked him directly about my baseball cards. He waved his hand dismissively and told me he'd taken care of that old junk. He'd sold the whole collection to some dealer who came by after seeing his Craigslist ad. The man had looked through everything and offered what my dad considered a fair price for what he described as old cardboard. My hands started shaking as I asked him how much he'd gotten for them. He reached into his wallet and pulled out 5 $20 bills, placing them on the coffee table between us with a satisfied smile. He told me he'd gotten $100 for the entire collection, which he considered generous since most of it was just worthless paper that didn't deserve the storage space it was taking up. I stared at those bills, feeling a rage building inside me that I'd never experienced before. But years of military training had taught me discipline and control. Instead of exploding, I forced myself to smile and thanked him for handling it. I told him I appreciated him taking care of things while I was away. My dad seemed pleased with my reaction, probably expecting me to be grateful for his initiative. He launched into a speech about how I needed to focus on practical things now that I was a man and a soldier. He said collecting cards was a childhood hobby that I'd outgrown, and the $100 could go towards something useful. I nodded along, agreeing with everything he said while my mind raced. I excused myself to unpack and went upstairs to what used to be my room. It had been completely transformed into an office space, with a new desk, filing cabinets, and not a trace of my former life there. I sat on the floor where my card collection used to be stored and tried to process what had happened. That night, I called my grandfather's old friend who owned a sports memorabilia shop across town. I'd known him since I was a kid, and he'd always been impressed with my collection. When I told him what happened, he was quiet for a long moment before asking me if I still had the insurance appraisal I'd gotten 2 years earlier. The appraisal. I'd completely forgotten about it. When I turned 18, my grandfather's friend had suggested I get my most valuable cards appraised for insurance purposes, especially since I was planning to enlist and would be away from home. I'd paid for a professional appraisal and stored the paperwork in my car's glove compartment, planning to set up insurance when I got back from boot camp. I ran out to my car and found the folder exactly where I'd left it. My hands trembled as I opened it and saw the official letterhead of the certified sports memorabilia appraiser. The total estimated value of my collection was listed at $89,000. $89,000. The 1952 Mickey Mantle rookie card alone was valued at $35,000. The 1955 Roberto Clemente rookie card was worth $12,000. My grandfather's 1951 Willie Mays rookie card was appraised at $18,000. There were dozens of other valuable cards, each worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. I sat in my car reading through the detailed breakdown, feeling sick to my stomach. My father had sold nearly $90,000 worth of collectibles for $100 because he thought they were worthless cardboard. The next morning, I asked my dad for the contact information of the dealer who'd bought my cards. I told him I was curious about the transaction and wanted to understand the market better. He seemed proud to share the details, giving me the man's name and phone number from a business card he'd kept. I called the dealer immediately. When I explained who I was, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. The man's voice became cautious as he told me he'd already sold most of the collection to various collectors and couldn't reverse the transactions. When I mentioned the insurance appraisal, he admitted he'd known exactly what he was buying, but figured my father had the right to sell at whatever price he wanted. The dealer offered to buy back what he still had for what he called a fair market price, but explained that the most valuable pieces had already been sold to collectors who'd been searching for them for years. He estimated that maybe $20,000 worth of the original collection was still available, and he'd sell it back to me for $15,000. I thanked him and hung up, realizing that pursuing legal action would be complicated and expensive, with no guarantee of recovering anything close to the full value. For the next week, I said nothing to my father about the appraisal. I watched him enjoy his new office space, occasionally making comments about how much better the room looked without all that junk cluttering it up. He seemed genuinely pleased with himself for taking initiative and handling what he saw as a necessary cleanup. I spent that week researching and planning. I contacted several lawyers about my options, learned about the legal complexities of recovering sold property, and calculated the realistic costs of pursuing various remedies. More importantly, I researched my father's own prized possessions and their values. My dad was a car enthusiast who'd spent years restoring a 1967 Mustang Fastback that he kept in the garage. He'd invested thousands of dollars and countless hours into making it perfect. He often talked about how it was his retirement fund, worth at least $40,000 in its current condition. He also had a collection of vintage tools that had belonged to his father, which he kept in pristine condition in a locked cabinet. While not as valuable as my cards, I estimated they were worth several $1,000s and represented his connection to his own father's memory. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after learning about the appraisal, I asked my dad if we could sit down and talk. I told him I had something important to share about the baseball cards he'd sold. I pulled out the insurance appraisal and placed it on the same coffee table where he'd put my $100. I watched his face as he picked up the document and began reading. His expression changed from confusion to disbelief to horror as he processed the numbers. He looked up at me with wide eyes and asked if this was real. I confirmed that it was an official appraisal from a certified expert, completed just 2 years earlier. I explained that the collection he'd sold for $100 was actually worth $89,000. My father's face went completely white. He set the appraisal down with shaking hands and stared at it for several minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up, he started apologizing frantically, saying he had no idea and that he'd never have sold them if he'd known their value. I told him I understood that he hadn't known and that I wasn't angry with him for making an honest mistake. His relief was visible as he thanked me for being understanding about the situation. Then I explained what I'd learned from calling the dealer. I told him that most of the valuable cards had already been sold to other collectors and were essentially gone forever. I mentioned that some pieces might be recoverable for about $15,000, but that the majority of the collection's value was permanently lost. My father immediately offered to pay for recovering whatever was possible. He said he'd find a way to get the $15,000 to buy back what remained. I thanked him for the offer, but told him I'd been thinking about the situation and had a different idea. I explained that I'd been doing some research into the legal aspects of the situation. While I understood that he'd acted without malicious intent, the fact remained that he'd disposed of my property without permission while I was serving my country. I mentioned that several lawyers had told me I had grounds for a lawsuit to recover the full appraised value. My father's face went pale again as he realized the legal implications of what he'd done. He started asking about lawyers and lawsuits, clearly panicking about the potential consequences. I let him worry for a moment before telling him that I didn't want to pursue legal action against my own father. Instead, I proposed an alternative arrangement that would make things right between us without involving courts or lawyers. I suggested that he sign over the title to his restored Mustang to me as compensation for the lost collection. The car was worth about $40,000, which was less than half of what my cards had been worth, but I was willing to accept that as settlement for the situation. My father sat in stunned silence for several minutes. I could see him calculating the value of his car against the value of what he'd destroyed, realizing that my proposal was actually quite generous given the circumstances. He asked if I was serious about accepting the car as full settlement. I confirmed that I was, explaining that I valued our relationship more than pursuing maximum financial recovery. I told him that signing over the Mustang would demonstrate that he understood the magnitude of what had happened and was willing to make meaningful amends. After another long pause, my father agreed to the arrangement. He said he understood that he'd made a terrible mistake and that giving up his car was appropriate compensation for destroying something so valuable that belonged to me. We went to the DMV that afternoon and completed the title transfer. As we walked back to the car that was now mine, my father apologized again for not understanding the value of my collection. He said he'd learned an important lesson about respecting other people's property and interests, even when he didn't personally understand their value. I thanked him for making things right and told him I was glad we could resolve the situation without damaging our relationship permanently. I explained that the experience had taught me the importance of communicating clearly about valuable possessions and ensuring that everyone in the family understood what should and shouldn't be touched. Update 1. 3 weeks after getting the Mustang, I received an unexpected phone call from the memorabilia dealer. He told me that one of the collectors who'd bought cards from my collection had contacted him with an interesting proposition. Apparently, this collector had done his own research after purchasing several of my cards and discovered they were part of a larger collection that had been sold without the owner's knowledge. He felt uncomfortable keeping cards that had essentially been stolen, even though he'd purchased them legitimately. The collector offered to sell back the cards he'd bought for exactly what he'd paid for them, which was about $8,000 for pieces that were worth nearly $20,000 according to my appraisal. He said he collected for the love of the hobby, not to profit from someone else's misfortune. I was amazed by this unexpected turn of events. Using money from selling some of the Mustang's aftermarket parts, I was able to buy back about a quarter of my original collection's most valuable pieces. When I told my father about this development, he seemed genuinely happy that I was able to recover some of my cards. He offered to help pay for the buyback, but I declined, explaining that our previous arrangement had settled the matter completely. Update 2. 2 months later, my father approached me with a surprising request. He said he'd been thinking about our situation and wanted to do something additional to make amends. He'd been researching baseball card collecting and had learned about upcoming card shows and auctions. He proposed that we attend some of these events together, with him helping me rebuild my collection as a way of learning about something that was important to me. He said he wanted to understand why the cards had meant so much to me and to support my hobby going forward. I was skeptical at first, remembering his years of dismissive comments about my collecting. But his offer seemed genuine, and I decided to give him a chance to prove his sincerity. We started going to monthly card shows together. My father was amazed by the knowledge and passion of the collectors we met. He began to understand that serious collecting involved research, expertise, and genuine appreciation for the history and artistry of the cards themselves. Over several months, he helped me acquire several pieces that partially replaced some of what had been lost. While we couldn't recreate the exact collection I'd had before, we were building something new together that had its own meaning. The experience changed our relationship in ways I hadn't expected. My father began asking me about the players featured on different cards, learning about baseball history and statistics that connected to the hobby. He started to see collecting not as childish accumulation of worthless objects, but as a form of historical preservation and artistic appreciation. Update 3. 6 months after the initial incident, my father made an announcement that completely surprised me. He said he'd been saving money from various sources and had managed to accumulate enough to make one final gesture of apology. He presented me with a cashier's check for $25,000, explaining that he'd been setting aside money from his salary, selling some of his own possessions, and even taking on some freelance work to raise the funds. He said this represented his acknowledgement that the Mustang alone hadn't fully compensated me for what I'd lost. I was speechless. The check, combined with the value of the car and the cards we'd recovered, actually exceeded the original appraised value of my collection. More importantly, it demonstrated that my father had truly understood the magnitude of his mistake and was committed to making things completely right. I tried to refuse the additional money, explaining that I considered the matter settled but my father insisted. He said that giving me the check wasn't just about financial compensation anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could acknowledge a serious mistake and take full responsibility for fixing it. We deposited the check together, and I used part of the money to purchase insurance for my rebuilt collection. I also set aside funds for future acquisitions and invested the remainder in a way that would support my long-term collecting goals. The most valuable thing that came from this entire experience wasn't financial recovery or even the cards themselves. It was the transformation of my relationship with my father from one characterized by dismissal and misunderstanding to one based on mutual respect and shared interests. My father learned that dismissing someone else's passions without understanding them can have serious consequences. I learned that people can change their attitudes and behaviors when they're confronted with the real impact of their actions. We still go to card shows together regularly. My father has even started a small collection of his own, focusing on players from his childhood era. He approaches it with the same attention to detail and research that he once mocked in my collecting. The rebuilt collection will never be exactly the same as what I lost, but it represents something different and perhaps more valuable. Every card we've acquired together carries the story of rebuilding trust and understanding between a father and son. When people ask me about the situation now, I tell them that losing my original collection was devastating, but the process of addressing what happened ultimately strengthened my family relationships in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. My father occasionally brings up the incident, usually when we're at card shows or working on our collections together. He uses it as a reminder to himself and others about the importance of respecting other people's interests and property, even when you don't personally understand their value. The experience taught both of us that the true worth of a collection isn't just in its monetary value, but in the passion, knowledge, and memories that surround it. While money can replace the physical objects, it can't recreate the years of research, discovery, and emotional connection that made the original collection special. But sometimes, building something new together can create different kinds of value that are just as meaningful as what was lost.